Welcome to the New Intellectuals. My name is Jordan Camp. I'm Director of Research at the People's Forum in New York City, and I'm really delighted to be joined today by Gerald Horne. He is the John J. and Rebecca Moores Professor of African American History at the University of Houston. He's the author of more than 36 books, including The Apocalypse of Settler Colonialism, The Roots of Slavery, White Supremacy, and Capitalism in 17th Century North America and the Caribbean, Alfred Monthly Review, White Supremacy Confronted U.S. Imperialism and Anti-Communism versus the Liberation of Southern Africa from Rhodes to Mandela, out from International Publishers, and most recently, in the book we'll be discussing today, The Dawning of the Apocalypse, The Roots of Slavery, White Supremacy, Settler Colonialism, and Capitalism in the Long 16th Century, just published by Monthly Review. So welcome, Gerald, and thank you very much for making the time to speak with me today.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
It's a pleasure. The publication of The Dawning of the Apocalypse comes at a very important moment. After all, we've seen ongoing mass protests against white supremacy and police violence amidst what some analysts would describe as perhaps the worst crisis in the history of capitalism. And these mass protests have taken shape in the wake of conversations around the anniversary of 1619, when some analysts, like Pulitzer Prize winner Nicole Hannah-Jones, traced the arrival of Africans to North America and the beginning of slavery. Yet, as the subtitle to your new book suggests, you trace the roots of the system to over 500 years ago, and alongside the rise of capitalism. By 1492, you demonstrate that slavery was an established fact that was extended to the Americas and deepened in Africa. So I wanted to start by asking how you came to this project and what inspired you to write this book now.
How I came to this project? Well, as you suggested, I did this book on the 17th century. Yeah. And when you study the 17th century, you become curious about the previous century as well. Interestingly enough, I think it was 2017 to 2018. You can find it on YouTube. I was doing in conversation with Paul Coates, the publisher of Black Classics Press and the father of Ta-Nehisi Coates. And I was grappling with this 16th century project, and I was actually asking the audience to give me a connective thread, because at that point, I hadn't really figured out things. I mean, I had bits and pieces, but I didn't have a connective thread. And I guess the lesson to my fellow scholars is just to keep digging, because eventually the connective thread will present itself. And I guess also one of the sub-themes of this book is, why are we sitting here speaking English? I mean, for example, why are we not here at all? Why are we not speaking Spanish? After all, they had the first mover's advantage and had established a settlement in St. Augustine, Florida, with enslaved Africans as early as 1565. Why aren't we speaking Turkish? I mean, really what was driving the Western Europeans was this fear of the Muslims, particularly the fearsome Ottoman Turks who were marching steadily westward. And as the saying goes, it was thought they were going to next take the Vatican itself and then march on to the Iberian Peninsula. And in some ways, the Iberians, when they were crossing the Atlantic in 1492, in some ways, they were scurrying away from the Ottoman Turks, for example. So in sum, what this book tries to do is in part answer this question of why we're speaking English. After all, this was a minor kingdom on the outskirts of Western Europe. And I even showed that in my 17th century book. Even in the 17th century, they were up until about the midpoint of the 17th century with the rise of Oliver Cromwell, when England begins to take off. But up until then, it's still a sort of a minor kingdom. And so there are a number of sub-themes in this book. One, of course, is how the English outflanked the Spanish. The Spanish, in terms of their settlements, relied heavily on being religiously correct. You had to be Catholic in order to be accepted in the settlements. I'm doing a book on Texas now, and as late as, say, 1819, 1820, when Moses and Stephen Austin are authorized by Spain, then Mexico, to move into what is now Texas, they had to profess Catholicism, for example. So they had this very strict religious test. And this is taking place in the 16th century in the context of these religious wars. I make a big deal about the St. Bartholomew's massacre in France in, I think, 1572. It's written down in the book, of course, where the Catholics invite the Protestants to these meetings and then fall upon them and massacre them all. Tens of thousands are massacred. It's not unlike what was visited upon Native Americans, when Native Americans would be invited to meetings and they would be liquidated at the beginning or the end or the middle of the meeting. And so there's this religious conflict, and the Protestants are outnumbered. They're the scrappy underdogs. They cannot afford to have a religious test for settlements. And so in a creative adaptation, they broadened the base for settler colonialism by taking a pan-European approach. Irish Catholics, who of course were bedeviled in that part of Europe, were accepted as settlers because in some sense, going to the unknown where you had to confront Native Americans was seen as a very dangerous mission, which of course it was, if not a fool's errand. And of course, London opened its embrace to the Jewish population. Interestingly enough, England had expelled the Jewish population in 1291, but by the 16th century, by the 1500s, they were under the gun. They could not afford to be choosy with regard to settlers. And so therefore, you had this pan-Europeanism morphing into whiteness, then transforming into white supremacy, ultimately. And as I say in the book, in some ways, this process is still bedeviling us because this was a process basically grounded in class collaboration between and amongst poor and richer Europeans. Now, I try to show that in my 17th century book when I talk about Bacon's Rebellion in 1676, where the settlers in Virginia try to overthrow London's rule because they didn't think London was moving rapidly enough to seize the land of the Native Americans and redistribute it to the Europeans. Of course, Bacon was a man of means. Those who were following him were not unlike the Trump coalition of 2016, 2020. And so I'm really trying to push forward this idea of class collaboration because I think the US left has a lot of mending and repairing to do in terms ideologically. I was thinking the other day that to a certain degree, when assuming we survive the pandemic, climate change, nuclear war, and historians look back, they might say, oh, being a part of the US left meant you just basically had a more sophisticated rationalization for class collaboration, basically. I mean, you stroked your chin as you rationalized and justified class collaboration, for example. And so that too is part of the, and then the part of the theme, of course, is the miscalculation by the Ottoman Turks, who really didn't take the English seriously. And so therefore they collaborated with them against what they considered to be the serious power, which were the Catholic powers, particularly the Spanish. And then I draw an analogy between I assume that when Washington made its bargain with China in early 1970s, they did not envision that the deal they made to encircle the Soviet Union, with China getting massive foreign direct investment from the United States and its allies in return, that would backfire, leading to this juggernaut. I assume that they did not envision that. But you know, with these people, you never know, because of course they could be on the take. But in any case, the Ottomans are collaborating with English and the Muslims are collaborating with English. And I find it ironic, and I haven't stressed this, and I'll just mention it here in passing. I find it ironic indeed that the Black population in the United States, it's mostly Protestants and Muslims. Even though if you look at the masters of our misery, it's basically been this collaboration between Protestants and Muslims, particularly in 1591, when they collaborate, that is, say, London and Morocco, to attack the Songhai Empire, a major political polity in Central West Africa, which is destabilized with knock-on effects ricocheting and cascading negatively as far south as today's Nigeria, softening up West Africa for the onrushing African slave trade, which I pinpoint as a turning point in the precipitous, vertiginous decline of Africa itself. So I would say finally that obviously the creation myth of settler colonialism needs to be revisioned, even on its own terms. On its own terms, it begins in Virginia, 1607, then a few years later in Massachusetts, but actually it's Florida and New Mexico, basically, with the Spanish moving into Florida, establishing the settlement, as I said, in 1565, although they had arrived before that and tried to establish a settlement in Pensacola, even before St. Augustine. And of course, we all know about Ponce de Leon and the search for the Fountain of Youth. And of course, Florida historically had been an adjunct of Cuba, which brings me to another point, which is that the Spanish, with their religious tests, could empower Africans to be conquistadors. And of course, these English, they hardly, these Anglos, they hardly want us to be in the army today. I mean, let alone in the 1500s. And that, of course, I think helps to unravel some of the problems people have when they go to Cuba, because the Black experience in Cuba has been altogether different from on the North American mainland. There's much more of a sense of the Black population in Cuba of Cubanidad, of being Cuban, because from the beginning of settler colonialism in the early 1500s, I mean, many of them were free. Many of them were conquistadors, unlike our experience here in North America. So they have much more of a sense of ownership of the country. And the Black population in the United States, understandably, is perpetually alienated. And then they expect everybody else to be alienated, which I understand, because if you haven't studied, you tend to look, everything is viewed through your own lens. But in any case, that's my long-winded, elongated response to your question.
Thank you. It's really helpful. I mean, it makes me think. The book does several things. On one hand, I think it brings together literatures that are often treated separately, right? Settler colonialism, slavery, the history of capitalism, and it brings it into one analytical frame. And, in doing so, as you just suggested, it offers, I think, perhaps the most persuasive definition of white supremacy that I've ever encountered, which is as a system of class collaboration. I mean, which you term, as you just explained, a kind of form of pan-Europeanism that united the wealthy with the not so well off in this kind of cross-class project against enslaved Africans and against indigenous peoples. And so on the other hand, though, and I wanted to ask you about this, is that you show how enslaved Africans and their indigenous comrades made all kind of trouble for this through engaging in class struggle and class conflict rather than class collaboration. And you demonstrate this through a look at a cycle of rebellion that really rocked, North America and the Caribbean. And so I wanted to ask you if you could talk about that dynamic, the other side, class struggle and class conflict.
Well, a sub-theme of this book is how there's something called a second mover's advantage. Routinely, we talk about the first mover's advantage. That helps to explain the success of Microsoft, for example. But there's a second mover's advantage. That is to say that the Spanish were fought so ferociously by the Africans and the indigenous population that they both fought each other to exhaustion to a certain degree. Then, by the time 1607 rolls around, the Spanish, from their perch in St. Augustine, they realize what's going on. They realize that London is invading what they call Virginia and attempt to establish a settlement there. But they're basically at a loss to do anything about it because they've been so weakened in Florida over the years. Now, many who are listening to me now probably know about the subsequent history of Florida, the people we know as the Seminoles, how in the 19th century, after the United States takes over from Spain, circa 1820, the Seminoles and the Africans basically fight the United States to a standstill in three different wars, 1819, 1820, middle 1830s, and then the 1850s, before they're all subjected to ethnic cleansing and moved westward to southern Texas and to Mexico, where their descendants continue to reside. Well, this was nothing new. This was unfolding in the 1500s as well. And once again, to answer this question of why we're sitting here speaking English, a part of it has to do with the resistance of the indigenous and their African comrades. And this brings me to another point in terms of trying to understand and unravel this pornography of violence, these Black men being killed on tape on a regular basis. I find it somewhat disappointing that even those who consider themselves to be class warriors and turn up their nose at what they call identity politics, which I'm not sure what that means, but sometimes it seems to mean anytime Black people organize. But they haven't been able to understand that in part of what's unfolding in our streets is an unresolved class question. That is to say that unlike the settlers, the enslaved from the beginning were engaged in class struggle. Ultimately, their class struggle creates a crisis for the Republic leading to the US Civil War, but unresolved is this still obtaining idea that their lives are cheap and therefore they can be executed willy-nilly. Unresolved is the fact that the slave owners were expropriated without compensation, leaving them furious, which of course leads to the rise of Ku Klux Klan, but that's not all. It drove many wealthy families into poverty. And to tie this back to the 1500s, unresolved is this point that the enslaved population was not adverse to collaborating with the antagonists of the slaveholders, be it the man I call the John Brown of France, who was repeatedly sailing throughout the Caribbean to collaborate with the Africans against their slave owners, continuing with the Africans under the Union Jack collaborating with the Spanish against the English, up to and including Stonewall's Revolt in 1739, then collaborating with the English against the Yankees post 1776, perpetually collaborating with the indigenous population, as noted with regard to the people we call the Seminoles and other ethnic groups, indigenous ethnic groups, too numerous to mention. Continuing the 20th century, Black nationalists collaborating with Tokyo, Black Marxists collaborating with Moscow, Havana. And so I think that if we understand this unresolved class question of slavery, it puts us on a faster track to resolving this apparent mystery of why are these Black men perpetually being killed on camera, and hopefully putting us on a faster track towards repairing this situation through a dedicated program of reparations, for example.
Well, I want to ask you about, that connection that you just drew between this book and Black Marxists collaborating with Moscow and with Havana. This has been a major theme in your work. And some may read your work as a shift, the shift towards this longer periodization. I read it rather as a kind of culmination of your long project to demonstrate the importance of situating apparently domestic developments within a global correlation of forces. And, after all, in this new book, you extend a deepened scholarship that really goes back at least to some of your earliest books like Black and Red, where you show the costs for failing to grapple with, W.B. Du Bois's trenchant critiques of white supremacy, of capitalism, of colonialism at mid-century. And, anti-communism, you've long argued, led to a retreat from their global visions and created a vacuum that was filled by the far right and by the imperialists, a theme that you also take up in a timely and important book for our own moment, Fire This Time, the Watts Uprising in the 1960s. So which one is it? Continuation or a departure in your view?
I guess it's a little bit of both. I mean, obviously this book is trying to put the Black struggle in a global context. And that's nothing new in terms of my project. But obviously going back in time, I'm still debating whether I should stop here in terms of going back in time. Stop at 1492, actually 1453, because that's when the Ottoman Turks seize Constantinople, and that's really what kicks off this whole enterprise of settler colonialism, slavery, et cetera, as I explained a few moments ago. So I'm still torn as to whether I should stop with 1453 or keep going back. But of course, like everybody else, I'm affected by the pandemic. And it's unclear when these archives are going to open, which, I have to say, I feel wounded as a result, because to be frank with you, for about 20 years, I've been traveling just about every weekend when I'm not writing to archives. And now I'm not doing that anymore. And, I'm going to have to reinvent myself.
Well, I certainly hope that, the research that our, scientists in Cuba and China can get as they anticipate, a vaccine into our hands so that we can travel again, and that it's a public good and we don't have these corporations get their hands on it. So, the world would benefit from your labors in the archives. It's an amazing thing for us, a real gift to the world. I wanted to, ask you about this, that you just talked about, the global context. You not only challenged, I think, the periodization of the roots of white supremacy. You're talking about, mostly U.S. historians trace it as originating in the U.S. And despite the kind of range of scholarship on the topic, few have looked at the roots of white supremacy in this global context that you trace for us. And you suggest that it's important to do so, as your answers have explained, because of the dominance, not the least of which is of London in the slave trade and colonialism, absolutely critical to the process in North America. And so, I just wanted to, kind of come back to this where we started now, and invite you to say why that global context is so important now for these, ongoing struggles.
Well, Fox News has been playing up lately something that we should pay attention to, which is that Burkina Faso, the country in Central West Africa, on behalf of the African Union, is pushing a motion at the United Nations Human Rights Council with regard to what they call, quote, systemic racism, unquote, in the United States of America. This is, in many ways, a breakthrough. The last time Africa spoke with one voice about Black Americans was in May 1963 with the protests in Birmingham, which they denounced in extravagant terms. And this is taking place at the same time that just to cite some events that I've been involved in. So I've been doing these interviews on German television about the protests. And so I was being interrogated on German television just a few days ago by this anchor who was pressing me to agree that those defined as white in the United States should have collective guilt and collective responsibility for what's befallen Native Americans and Africans. Now, of course, my theory of the case is that, and of course, this is in a way a turnabout, because after 1945, the United States pressed Germany to accept collective responsibility for the Holocaust, et cetera, and then twisted Berlin's arm till it paid reparations to Israel, even though Israel didn't exist in 1945. And so as he was pressing me, I was interpreting this in the context of the decline in the North Atlantic Alliance. My mind reeled back to that episode where at a meeting, supposedly, the oath in the Oval Office, the 45th US president apparently threw something at Angela Merkel to express his disgust with her. Of course, the fact that she's a woman leader, I'm sure had something to do with it. And so I was thinking, you know, they're turning the tables. I mean, basically, he doesn't want me to say that fascism was a product of big business and that there was a thriving anti-fascist left. He wants me to turn the tables and blame everybody, all those defined as white. And it's very interesting. And of course, I don't see my job, even if I didn't necessarily agree with them, as defending those defined as white in the United States. Trust me, they have enough means to defend themselves. They don't need me to defend them. But I thought that this was an interesting moment in terms of global politics, in terms of what's happening at the United Nations, in terms of the global protests against the United States, which to me, in some ways expresses disgust and revulsion at Mr. Trump, and this is a way to express it as much as it is to demonstrate solidarity with Black Americans. It also, in my estimation, represents how the anti-Trump wing of the US ruling class recognizes that they have a dilemma, that they really need to reshuffle the deck if they want to get rid of Trump in November, because even today, there's no guarantee that he'll be removed. And then I thought back to the headline of the Financial Times of London about how in the last few days, corporations have donated $500 million to organizations like the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund. So I think we're in a very fluid moment right now. And what's going to happen in the United States, obviously, is not necessarily dependent exclusively on what goes on in the United States. It's part of global trends, such as Burkina Faso's initiative at the United Nations in league with the African Union. And of course, Burkina Faso is in the French sphere of influence. It's difficult for me to believe that they would have done this without a heads up to Paris. And of course, the German disgust with Mr. Trump. And so, and then all this taking place in the context of the trade war with China as well. So I think that in order to understand, once again, what's going to happen in the streets of the United States and how that's going to eventuate, it would be a mistake to assume that it's solely conditioned on what goes on here, particularly when Mr. Trump's popularity ratings are still in the 40s and have barely moved. I mean, in so-called good times, he's in the high 40s. At times like this, he's in the low 40s. And that combined with voter suppression, which we saw in Georgia in the primaries just a few days ago, makes it difficult to predict the election. So that's why a person like myself pays a lot of attention to global events, because I realize that historically, given our disadvantageous position here in North America, that it's, we need those gusts from the international community in order to move forward.
Well, Gerald, I want to thank you very much for taking this time to speak with me. I know that I speak on behalf of my colleagues when I thank you, and I want to recommend to our listeners and our viewers that if they haven't already, to purchase a copy of The Dawning of the Apocalypse, The Roots of Slavery, White Supremacy, Settler, Colonialism, and Capitalism in the Long 16th Century, which is out from Monthly Review. It's a very important and timely book. It depicts the origins of our time. So Gerald, thank you again for joining us on The New Intellectuals.